I'm Kourtney Smith.
And I'm Elyse Sharp.
And we are two Shakespeare nerds who decided to make a podcast about our love for Shakespeare.
In this podcast, we will tackle as many dimensions to Shakespeare's plays as we can by looking at the text, examining the historical context in which it was written, and how the text is viewed through modern lenses of feminism, racism, classism, colonialism, nationalism, ableism, all of the isms.
We will discuss how his plays shaped both the past and present, and, as actors, how his plays can be responsibly performed today.
All while trying our best to approach his works without giving in to bardolatry. So, Shakespeare Anyone? Hi, listeners. Elyse here to remind you of all the ways you can support the podcast and the work that Kourtney and I do. First up, we have a Patreon. Our Patreon patrons receive exclusive bonus content. Every month, we do a roundup of Shakespeare-related content we have found online. We also share Patreon-exclusive bonus episodes of the podcast. These look like extended versions of episodes you've heard here, collaborations with other Shakespeare podcasters, and Kourtney and I doing reviews of Shakespeare-adjacent media, like TV shows, movies, and books that are inspired by or loosely based on Shakespeare and Shakespeare plays. Patreon patrons also receive snail mail from the podcast, and some levels even vote on future episodes of our podcast. If you are interested in checking out our Patreon, or just the Shakespeare-related names we've given the tiers of support, head to patreon.com/Shakespeare Anyone. The link is also in our episode description. After you've done that, please rate, review, and follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Your review might even make it on an episode. You can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and tell a friend. Word of mouth is our best form of advertising. Thank you so much for all of the support you give the podcast. Now, on to the episode. Hi, Kourtney.
Hi, Elyse. How's it going?
It's going pretty well. How are you?
I'm doing well. I am a little bit under the weather. I have a cold, so if I sound a little congested, that is why.
Yeah.
Luckily, I tested and I don't have COVID, so that's a good thing. It's just one of those standard colds with some sniffles and some coughs here and there.
Yeah.
But other than that, I am doing well.
Still a bummer to have a cold.
Oh, certainly, especially on a audio medium where I'm going to be speaking and providing information and, sounding a little bit like a kid in a cartoon or something.
You don't sound that bad, I promise.
Okay, good.
At least in my ear, you do not sound that bad.
Cool.
What are we talking about today, Kourtney?
Today we are talking about youth in Romeo and Juliet, youth in early modern England. Specifically, we are focusing on what we call teenagerdom. So being adolescence, being a teenager. The two protagonists in Romeo and Juliet are notably, at least we know Juliet, based on the text, is 13 years old. So these two characters are in their teens. Mm-hmm. They're not, early 20s. They're not in their 30s.
Yeah.
We know specifically that they are teens. And it's really prominent, too, that these characters are so young.
Yeah, it's a big factor. And I think also there's sometimes some misconceptions about the past in general and historical periods where there might be a misconception that teenagerdom, adolescence didn't exist in the same way that it does today. And of course, not the exact same way, but that doesn't mean that it didn't exist at all. And I think there's the misconception is hearing it not the same way and hearing that as not at all. Oh, you were just a kid, you were a child, and then you were an adult. And there is, at least in my reading, and I think yours too, in our, as we were talking about what we were reading today, early modern culture did have a sense that there was a time period in a person's life where they were going through changes and not a child anymore, not an adult either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What's in a name?
Mm-hmm.
Adolescents, teenagers. So that's what the focus is today. And I'm excited because from my experience, I don't hear a lot about in-depth analysis about youth culture in these plays.
Yeah.
At least I don't remember that. I remember studying Romeo and Juliet in 9th grade English, and I walked away thinking, wow, they're just dumb teenagers. and the nuance, the complexity of the characters, their age, what that meant, what that means, was not really present in my educational learning of this play.
Yeah. And before we dive into Teenagerdom in early modern England and Romeo and Juliet, I want to let everybody know that we just discussed a take on Romeo and Juliet that centers its teenage characters, the 2022 romantic comedy film Rosalind, over on our Patreon. If you want to hear that discussion and other Shakespeare-adjacent content that we have watched, you can join us at patreon.com/Shakespeare Anyone. To start off with, we've already talked a lot about the idea of age and aging and hormonal changes in early modern life in other episodes of the podcast, specifically thinking about our girlhood episode with Titus Andronicus. We also have talked about the ages of man concept in other earlier episodes. So just as like a quick refresher, trying to remember everything in case it's been a while since you listened to those episodes or you haven't made your way through our back catalog yet. Early modern conceptions of age were based in humoral theory, this idea that there are 4 main fluids of the body that have different aspects and different personalities attached to them, and every adult human is trying to achieve a balance, but there are also natural states that, like, men are hot and dry and women are cold and wet. And like just across gender, ages also had ideal humoral temperaments. So infants were full of moisture and soft in terms of their flesh. And then throughout life, the long trajectory is people harden and dry out. By the time we're old, we are hard and dry.
As raisins.
Yeah. And the changes that occurred during puberty were also discussed in the context of humoral theory. So the idea of like more body hair appearing was thought to be an expression of like the change of the humors, of certain humors coming literally out of your body in the form of hair. And during puberty specifically is when the early modern concept of those changes to like temperature and moisture, softness, hardness start, and they start to see more heat in young people across the gender spectrum. So people going through a testosterone-based puberty and an estrogen-based puberty are both a little bit more choleric because as we know now, all those hormone changes certainly do make anyone a little bit more testy.
Yeah.
And then beards were a key sign of physical maturity for men, and pubic hair for both men and women, which were also called the beards below, were we didn't cover this, but so the beards below, and for men, beards above, were key signs of physical maturity in early modern society. And then because you can't necessarily see everyone's beards below, for young women, people going through an estrogen-based puberty, blushing was also a sign of sexual readiness after a certain age. So blushing was eroticized. So before we dive in today, I do want to let everyone know that towards the end of our episode, we will be discussing suicide rates in adolescents in the early modern period, as Romeo and Juliet does have as a plot point the self-inflicted deaths of 2 teenage characters. We do want to urge our listeners to listen with caution. We will stop before getting into that and let you know when it's about to happen. And if you or anyone you know is struggling with thoughts of suicide, we encourage you to visit the International Association of Suicide Prevention to find your local suicide helpline. If you are in the United States, you can text or call 988. And we will put links to both of those in the episode description.
Thank you, Elyse.
Now, let's talk really quickly about some things that we've already talked about on the episode in terms of adolescence in the early modern period. And in my reading, Victoria Sperry's article, Performing Puberty, Fertile Complexions in Shakespeare's Plays, she also mentions that it's important to note that while 14 was kind of seen as the like age of consent and the age of maturity mentally during this time period, well, age of consent was 12, but 14 was kind of seen when you were a quote-unquote adult. Sperry does note that, quote, on their 14th birthdays, it is clear that boys and girls were not abruptly deemed mature men and women, yet nor were these pubescent boys and girls indistinguishable from each other, unquote. So even though like there was a legal defining in terms of how people were treated by the law at 14, socially it's very clear that early modern English culture was not treating these young people like full-blown adults at 14.
So even though legally you are now an adult, there's this cultural, well, not really.
Yeah.
I guess like how people today in at least like Western society, like 18, you're an adult, but when you're in college, you're still seen as not fully an adult.
Yeah.
Or when you're first in the job market.
Yeah, I would also argue that, we do still see this today where children under the age of 18 are tried for crimes as adults in our legal system past the age of 14, depending on the crime.
And the state.
The state and, the background of those individuals.
Yeah. Yeah.
Some people are more likely to be tried as adults based on their appearance than others.
Yeah. Adultification of specifically Black and brown girls and boys is,
Yeah. So I think that's an important call out to make of like, one, this does still exist today, this adultification of children over the age of between the ages of 14 and 18. I think college is a great call out of like 18 to 22. It's like, you're kind of an adult. You're not a full adult yet.
Yeah.
Just like a great misconception to dispel. Like, it wasn't like you were 14, you all of a sudden became a house owner,
Right.
And then Sperry goes on to discuss how this would appear in theater. And, we've talked about the boy actors and that beardlessness specifically was a big key example of how they could make a boy actor appear as a young woman. The lack of a beard would help display that this was a woman or a prepubescent young man, whereas the addition of a beard would demonstrate that this is a postpubescent man, an adult man.
Yeah.
And then they could also use either the actor's natural blush or makeup to feminize the character if they were playing a pubescent or postpubescent woman.
Yeah. And we also know that there was a lot of pearl clutching over the use of makeup and rouge for women or anyone female presenting. So blush is this thing that is natural or artificial to be like, this is a woman.
Yeah, and that this is a woman with like sexual desire because, as I mentioned briefly, blushing was specifically eroticized. It was this idea that it was the thoughts, like sexy thoughts, the anticipation of a sexual encounter would cause blush. So
I see.
It became an erotic thing.
Thank you for explaining that like journey for the early modern logic.
Yeah, which is also why wearing blush as makeup would be super scandalous because it's basically wearing something super provocative.
Yeah. You're basically saying like, I'm thinking about sexual things. Yeah.
I'm thinking about sex.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a brief overview of some things that we've already discussed about teenagerdom outside of just the context of teenagerdom, but that are present in early modern society and how they thought of teenagerdom. Now, you have a little bit more on how Romeo and Juliet specifically kind of examines and takes apart this idea of young people.
Yeah. And like the emergence of a teenager as this concept in like the ages. Yeah, my reading, I read the article Youth and Privacy in Romeo and Juliet by Rachel Prusco. And in the article, Prusco suggests that the characters of Romeo and Juliet likely appeared to Shakespeare's original audience as troubling, unsettling figures because the play dismantles understandings of young people in Shakespeare's England. In our courtship and marriage episode, we talked about how the courting and the marriage of these two characters was likely riskier than some people give credit for with these characters in this play. And there was a lot on the line in terms of like courting and marriage. There was also a lot on the line for like becoming a teenager. Teenagers were developing as this idea that there are people who are not children, not adults, but they are also like able to self-actualize. And we've talked about growing youth culture in our manhood episode, specifically talking about boys and men. We talked about the evolution of the word girl in our Titus episode and what that means. For example, the use of girl versus maid to describe Juliet once the two consummate their marriage. We've talked about courtship and night courtship and how risky that was. And we've also talked about young men and how they dominate night culture. So like you said, we've already talked about some of these things. In addition, the article also argues that the play's private spaces, like the balcony, the bedroom, among other places, makes possible a private language that is a kind of early teen speak. Yeah, and I'll get into that towards the end of this, but I want to first contextualize this idea of being a teenager and that being performed. So let's start with early modern vocabulary. Writer Paul Griffith's analysis of the early modern period's quote-unquote vocabulary of age finds that youth was the usual descriptor for the stage of life between childhood and adolescence. By comparison, the word adolescent, which has medieval origins, appears less frequently than youth, and the word teen was first recorded in 1673. So more likely these characters would have been described as youths rather than being called adolescent or teen. And even though the use of the word teenager in Shakespeare's England is anachronistic, Prusko suggests that young people contribute to the new conception of youth that we can recognize in the 21st century. And by that, she means that these characters resist authority, they're emotional, they are prone to peer pressure, and are, quote, above all, impossible to understand, unquote. So even though these characters are 400 years old, we can still see them in modern teenagers.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that I say this is a time where the concept of a teenager was being developed, even though, again, early modern people wouldn't use the word teenager, but this concept, we can use this word to explore youth in the time period. In Shakespeare's time, the age category of youth was depicted in religious manuals, educational writings, autobiographies, and literature as prone to sin and violence, lustful, and ungodly. That's how youth were usually depicted.
Mm-hmm.
Protestant preachers wrote of youth's immoral activities, disobedience, and insubordination, and they were frequently viewed as rebellious and requiring a firm hand. Even though youths were viewed in a negative light, there was still a positive view of the youths as people capable of being converted into reasoned decision makers, capable of receiving religious instruction. So even though youths were feared, I suppose, by the adult authorities, they were still seen as being trained into reasonable people.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this sounds very similar to what I was reading in terms of humoral theory, where it was this is just a time where they are more choleric and, eventually it'll pass,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is still true of teenagers today. And now we just know why.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the other thing that is notable is this idea that we need to train teenagers to be upstanding citizens with piety and reason. And so
Mm-hmm.
grammar schools, apprenticeships, nunneries were all good places for the youths. I feel very silly calling them the youths. I feel like Schmidt in New
The
Girl.
youths.
But yeah, you're mentioning that teenagers or adolescents were viewed as having more cholera, being choleric.
Mm-hmm.
The era also focused more on young people as types rather than individuals. So yeah, they are choleric and they are this type of person or these types of people. And this categorization is evidenced in the period's morality plays. Oftentimes on the stage, plays featured a stock character such as youth, and these characters often followed a basic sin and redemption pattern, heaven or hell. So that was the way that early modern people viewed adolescents and what we would consider teenagers. In spite of this very rigid binary that's imposed on young people, historians work on discovering lived experiences of early modern youth. And Griffiths calls this, quote, an extensive middle territory in which people blended orthodoxy with their own assumptions about authority, piety, work, time, youth, conviviality, and play, unquote. And Prusko writes that Shakespeare appears to have been interested in this aspect of young people and young characters as more nuanced, distinctive, and individuated. And some examples from the canon include Prince Hal, Anne Page of Merry Wives, Miranda of The Tempest, Marina of Pericles, and Perdita of The Winter's Tale. And these teens come of age on their own terms and engage in self-definition outside of the usual narratives that we see in literature, as well as the morality plays that I was just talking about. And to bring this individuality or this individualized character into Romeo and Juliet, Romeo certainly is at odds with the demands of his society. And Juliet additionally expresses a selfhood outside of the parameters of her culture. And so perhaps there's more nuance to the two protagonists than simply they're rebelling against their parents and society. In fact, they are discovering selfhood through interiorizing or creating an internal and private life. And this idea of a private life, the idea that people had true selves separate from their masked selves in public, first took hold during the early modern period. And Prisco didn't mention this. When I was reading this, I thought about how Romeo and Juliet first met at a masquerade, and there's this potential theatrical device of masking versus true self.
Right. And there's this idea that they meet each other, they meet each other's truth selves, and then they find out who they are in society, right? Like that's how this courtship happens, is they interact, they flirt, they like each other, and then they find out the like societal mask on top of that. And we talked, I think, briefly about that societal mask in our Macbeth series, because Macbeth has language about we must make our faces visards to our hearts. Fair face must hide what the false heart doth know. You know, we have to hide our inside lives.
Yeah, separate the two. The idea of the self in early modern literature and culture, it was both literal and psychological. So early modern people were psychologically making divides between the private self and the public self. And while they were doing that psychologically, they were also beginning to seek out private spaces if they could afford it. So that would include locking doors, getting locks for doors, locking doors, making specialized rooms, gardens, closets, etc. So private interior space was both literal as well as psychological. And we also see this shift of private in the Protestant Reformation in the newer personal relationship to God versus that external one, that public one.
Yeah. And it's probably also all like coming from the rise of humanism and humanist thought. Yeah.
Totally.
The idea of the individual and the selfhood, and now we need space for our selfhoods.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And through a public staging of private interiority, Prisco argues that Shakespeare confronts his audience with unstable representations of the young. Romeo and Juliet perform a private, youthful subjectivity that perhaps audiences didn't think could exist at all. Remember, before this, the youth in the morality plays were stock characters who were facing like heaven and hell, trying to become reasoned people, and they weren't considered individuals in the eyes of the adults. And Professor Mary E. Troll has noted that the key trope of overhearing in early modern works suggests that public and private boundary was becoming flexible. And in Romeo and Juliet, Romeo overhears Juliet on the balcony, and at the same time, the audience overhears their private conversation at the balcony, and overhearing young people's innermost thoughts conflicted with the depictions of youth at the time. So on stage, Shakespeare is performing interiority and giving audiences of likely adults the opportunity to experience young people with these interior self-identities that otherwise the audience might not think existed. So this was like a very big juxtaposition to what they expected from young people at this time. And even though the play performs this youth interiority, it does also perform stereotypes of young people. So we have like depictions of male culture, masculinity being public, sexual and violent. The play also reflects normative expectations for adolescent girls as subordinate to their parents and attentive to marriage. Although Kapilia Khan argued that in this play, girls are denied adolescence and have, quote, no sanctioned period of engagement with adult identities or activities, unquote. So while we do get like a girl, we don't get to really see what girlhood would be recreationally. Mercutio, Romeo, Benvolio, they all get to like party and have fun and be public.
Yeah, we get like a diversity of young male puberty, young male adolescence, and we get one. Well, we hear about Rosaline and that she's going to go become a nun.
Yeah.
And then we get Juliet.
Yeah. So I do want to acknowledge that like there is public youth, but Romeo and Juliet have a very private experience. And we learn a lot about them as young teenagers through their private moments. And so the private allows our protagonists to create a youth experience that is in opposition to parental authorities and allows them self-realization. She writes that the play offers a lot of private spaces for the lovers to remove their masks and for the audience to see their internal lives performed. Again, a youthful private life that wasn't depicted in previous early modern works. We see our protagonists' internal lives externalized on the balcony, in Juliet's room, and in Friar Lawrence's cell. Private spaces allow the young lovers to make sense of who they are becoming and self-fashioning. Romeo says, quote, "Call me but love and I'll be new baptized. Henceforth, I never will be Romeo," unquote. So he's throwing off his old identity and giving himself a new one.
Mm-hmm.
Juliet says, quote, "Take all myself," unquote. She's making an active choice for herself.
Yeah. They're engaging in this like identity making with each other. Yeah.
And in addition to finding private space, the two lovers also reimagine youth subjectively. In the private spaces of the balcony, Friar's cell, and Juliet's room, Romeo and Juliet speak freely and lay bare their interior selves. And this freedom can also be viewed as like a religious confession in the confines of the friar's cell. This private quote unquote confession helps the teens perceive themselves as individuals and like be their authentic selves, as if like you are going to confession with like a priest and laying it all bare. So in these private spaces, Romeo and Juliet, like we get to see who they authentically are versus who they are trying to be in front of their parents, in front of their friends, in front of society.
Right. Yeah. Or rather, like, we also even get that, like, Romeo is actively avoiding his parents and not talking to them, because at the top of the play, Lord and Lady Montague are asking Benvolio, like, have you talked to him? Like, we haven't seen him and we're worried.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good example of, like, he's also trying to, like, avoid putting the mask on by just making as much distance. Yeah. As much distance from himself and his family and his friends as possible. And one other thing that's, I think, really interesting is that the lovers also try to shed the feud's narrative and they try to replace it with one of their own. So in this private life, in these private spaces, outside of the view of their adult authorities, they are trying to be agents of their own lives and like disavow the feud and create their own like love story. And as far as the teen speak is concerned, Prusco argues that Romeo and Juliet seek to establish a way of speaking that reflects their private experience and distinguishes them from the adult community. They wish to change the narrative of their story from feud to marriage. They also dissimulate, so they hide their true selves and their actions from their parents and friends. And they engage in wordplay entirely their own. So, for example, they make a perfect sonnet with the alternating rhyme scheme, and there's plenty of wordplay throughout the play. And like you said, in the beginning of the play, Romeo is avoiding his parents. He does not want to talk to them. He is off in the sycamore grove because of Rosaline, or Rosaline's rejection of him, or whatever. He's trying to disengage from the adult community.
Yeah, rejecting the adult community. Yeah.
The other thing that I think is really interesting is, in addition to like changing the narrative, creating their own narrative, Romeo and Juliet also try to redefine words so that they fit into the narrative of their story, such as Montague and banishment. They change the meanings of those words, and the words make sense between the two of them, but they wouldn't make sense amongst the adult community as well as their other peers. And while Romeo and Juliet speak well with each other, Romeo and Juliet's language appears detached from their parents and peers. We sort of started talking about that a little bit. You mentioned that Romeo is linguistically detached from his parents and his friends. Juliet can't express what she wants to her parents or nurse. For example, Juliet masks when she pretends to submit to her father's will to marry Paris. Oftentimes, Juliet puts on a mask and says what people want her to say, but she's doing it in order to reach another end. Additionally, one I think is very funny is that Romeo speaks in that youthful attitude of like, you just wouldn't understand, to Friar when he is hidden in the cell awaiting banishment.
Right.
And Juliet can't understand why Nurse isn't moved by the immediacy of her love for Romeo when she sends Nurse out to deliver a message.
Right.
And Juliet also leans on very dramatic extremes when she explains to Friar all of the better alternatives to marrying Paris. And these feel very teenager. So there is this disconnect between like communication between Romeo and Juliet and everyone else in the story. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that Romeo and Juliet are able to find these private spaces, take off their masks, and self-actualize. And one thing that Prusco notes is that Romeo and Juliet might have played an integral role in introducing the modern-ish teenager to culture. And what she means by that is the play destabilized the preconceived notion of youth in early modern culture by staging young people with an inwardness as well as an ability to hide their inwardness. And through their inwardness, they're able to self-actualize, self-realize. Teenagers are searching for their identity. Like modern teenagers, we view them as like trying out different aesthetics and different activities in order to figure out who they are and who they want to be.
Mm-hmm.
And in a lot of ways, Romeo and Juliet do this through their relationship with each other in a culture that didn't view them as being much more than not children who are being trained into being adults with reason.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, my final thought on this is that I think that rather than dismissing these characters as young and stupid, we need to offer them a lot of grace because they were discovering self in a culture that didn't allow youth or teenagers to self-actualize.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that'll kind of tie into my like final note about early modern culture. And for those listening who do not want to hear about suicide, we are about to talk about it. So if that is not for you today, feel free to end the episode here or skip forward to the credits so you can hear our quote of the episode. Because I think the work of self-actualization ties into the suicide rates of young people in early modern England. I read Terence R. Murphy's Woeful Child of Parents' Rage, Suicide of Children and Adolescents in Early Modern England, 1507 to 1710. And this article was written in 1986. So Terence Murphy notes that early modern England had really comparatively high suicide rates for children and adolescents compared to the rates when he was writing this article, which was 1986. I don't have comparisons to today, but statistics are rather striking, and I believe that it is lower today. In the 16th and 17th century, children and adolescents committing suicide was not uncommon, unfortunately. And according to Murphy, from the records that we have that survive from the Court of the King's Bench, there were 13,968 suicides committed in England between 1485 and 1714. Ages were not recorded for all of these records because age was not recorded consistently for suicide across the board. However, there are 1,098 records where scholars can determine with some degree of accuracy the ages of the victims.
Mm-hmm.
And because there's no discernible pattern as to which records had ages included and which ones didn't, these 1,098 can be viewed as a representative sample of suicides across England at this time, because it is a roughly 8% sample. Out of the sample, 416, or roughly 38%, were age 21 or younger, and 192, 17.5% of all suicides, were victims 15 or younger.
Mm.
This means that, depending on where you were in England, as low as 1 in 5 suicides, as high as 2 in 5 suicides were committed by the people under the age of 21, which is really sad.
Yeah.
Yeah. Early modern culture tended to ascribe childhood suicide to a fear of and an impulsive attempt to escape from punishment by parents, employers, or magistrates. And there are records that indicate, for example, this person did this thing, knew it was wrong, was afraid of punishment by their parent or their master, and instead of facing punishment, killed themselves. Really, really sad.
Mm-hmm.
Terence says, quote, early modern English society assumed authoritarianism and demanded obedience from dependents so thoroughly that any motive other than fear and cowardly avoidance of a just correction was almost unthinkable. This attitude found expression in the common law. If a parent was moderately correcting his child, or a master his apprentice, servant, or scholar, and happened to occasion his death, the homicide was justifiable or excusable as misadventure, for the act of correction was lawful.
Mm.
However, if a servant killed his master, the treacherous and unnatural killing was murder of so odious a degree that it was deemed a species of treason, petite treason, and punished accordingly with extreme severity, unquote. So, in a society where admitting being found of wrongdoing by your parent or your master could lead to your death anyway. Some children chose to commit suicide. Murphy does point out that this does not mean that parents were across the board abusive to their child, and we do have records that are counter to the like adage of spare the rod, spoil the child, where parents, instead of spanking their child, like demonstrate spanking to a pillow as punishment to a child instead of actually hitting the child. There are many contemporary examples like that of parenting that does not involve physical abuse and finds an alternative to demonstrate punishment, but without actually physical harm being caused to a child. And Murphy argues that, quote, the employment of corporal punishment toward children must be considered in the context of the place of corporal punishment in early modern English society, obviously, and it must not be assumed automatically to indicate prevalent attitudes of hatred and hostility toward children, unquote. So while corporal punishment was practiced and was more common, it doesn't stem from a hatred of children or some sort of cultural opinion of children being lesser than, because everyone was corporally punished in early modern English society, right?
Right.
So any age could be beaten by their superior.
It sounds like the manhood episode that we did on Romeo and Juliet, and like the fact that husbands were allowed to punish corporally their wives, their children, their servants, and it was legal, it was accepted, and there was a line crossed sometimes, but that very much depended on the people around and what they thought the line was.
Right. Yeah. And this is a society where this type of violence is just more normalized. That doesn't excuse it, but that is what English society could not see any other reason for children committing suicide other than trying to escape corporal punishment, because that's what was so obvious to them. Murphy argues that this was not the cause of adolescent suicide, and that rather the isolation that young people went through at this key age was what was leading to the high rates of suicide. It was customary for children between 7 and 15, especially in lower classes, to go into service, apprenticeships, or tutelage away from their own homes. So losing the connections to family and the social structure around them when they go into these new roles in their life, and all of a sudden they become very isolated. Murphy notes that the, quote, child or adolescent, either already in service or still at home awaiting departure, had to be profoundly estranged, lonely, and anxious. It would matter little whether the master was kindly or brutal and the parents loving or cold. The young person was alone and trapped in a situation from which there could be no real escape, unquote. And I think that we can see this in Romeo and Juliet, because what they do in the face of their societal wrongdoing of marrying each other in the society that they do is stage a suicide and then later commit suicide. And I think that it helps explain why when Juliet's body is found when she's taken the potion, the reactions of the family, that this is something that happened with such unfortunate regularity in early modern English society. And it might seem extreme to our modern conceptions of the options that they have, but for them it is, Juliet goes to Friar and says, either you figure out something else, because the only thing I can think to do is end it. And I think this context helps explain why Romeo and Juliet turn to suicide so quickly.
Right. And in addition to Juliet literally threatening to kill herself, Romeo accepts banishment as worse than being killed.
Yeah.
And I think that ties into what you were talking about when it was these 7 to 15-year-olds are going off to some place without their social structure. And Romeo and Juliet are 13. And I mean, I think that Romeo's probably
not much older,
at most 15, 16. They're in that same window of time. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, imagine a 7-year-old during this time period, 7-year-olds could be sent off to live outside of their parents' homes. Is really, to a modern ear, really rough. Also really rough to consider that, people of that age considered suicide as an option in their lives. So that is kind of the reverse side of the coin of youth culture in early modern England, that there's this dark side to it, that 1 to 2 in 5 suicides committed in England during this time are young people.
Mm-hmm.
They're not a mentally healthy group.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're not well. And maybe it is that emerging self-realization that eventually gets us out of this time period and eventually gets us teenagers who are at least find themselves in adulthood.
Yeah. Yeah. They make it to adulthood.
Yeah, making it to adulthood. This is also a reason for the average age of death being young, and that like it's not just childhood illnesses like the plague, it's also a high suicide rate among early modern youths.
Mm. And like when I think about how modern audiences, modern readers explain like the plot of Romeo and Juliet, oftentimes the double suicide is just, oh yeah, and they end it with the double suicide. But I think that like because we have misconceptions about that period and what youth, what growing up, what suicide is in the time period, like the events of the play get brushed off as this very extreme tragedy, something that is, so over the top that when we talk about it, we're just going to say, oh, and it was a double suicide, and like not really question what that meant in the time period. Like, if that makes sense.
Right. Right. And something we talked about when we talked about Ophelia and Gertrude and female agency is drowning. And we talked about drowning being this kind of ambiguous death for suicide, especially for young women, and that suicide was a sin. It was both legally and spiritually damning. If you committed suicide in the early modern period, legally you had no more rights to your belongings. Those would be taken from you and any dependents that you had. And it was considered that you were going to hell, and you didn't get buried in a proper grave. You got buried at a crossroads in the dead of night.
Yeah.
And there are cases where the coroner and the coroner's juries kind of determine a sort of gray area, especially for these children, where they say that it was like an unhappy accident. They must have been playing and something went wrong. That happens a lot more in these records for children than for adults.
Mm-hmm.
So that is specifically something that we, as you were saying, we see this at the end of Romeo and Juliet. We kind of, some modern readers might not realize just how it doesn't necessarily click as a suicide because of the way that it's dramatized, right?
Right. And also, I think because a lot of the times people describe them as being stupid teenagers.
Yeah. And I think that one thing that I've kind of believed for a while is that Romeo and Juliet isn't necessarily the best play to introduce teenagers to, right? The like conception of them being quote unquote stupid teenagers. You don't want when you're greeted with characters who you're supposed to maybe relate to, and then, have people talk about them like they're stupid or ridiculous. And also you can't necessarily, because you're going through the extremes as well, it can look like, well, this isn't accurate. This isn't what teenagers do. I wouldn't do that.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of black and white thinking that is common in puberty, I've for a long time just thought this is maybe not the play to start students in just because they are the same age as the characters.
Mm-hmm.
I think what is really fascinating is that even though this is a time period where the concept is evolving, these characters being teens, these characters being young people under the age of 18 is woven so clearly throughout once you understand like the cultural context for what teenagers were at the time.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think because people now see teenagers as experiencing self-actualization and self-realization, the lengths that Romeo and Juliet go to in order to have something besides the feud and the societal expectations that their family has set out for them, it sometimes doesn't resonate in a modern understanding of teenagers. Like, I think that the early teenagers risk and the lengths that these early teenagers went to in order to self-actualize isn't appreciated, and we don't see that. Like, it's harder to identify.
Yeah, and the pressures that, I think I get what you're saying, that the pressures that these early modern teenagers were facing is different than the pressures faced by teenagers today, which can make it hard to see those in Romeo and Juliet, and instead it just looks like, it feels like they're making such extreme decisions to readers today, especially like teenage readers today, because teenagers today have more options, even if it doesn't always feel like it.
Mm-hmm. That is, I think, what I'm getting at. It's just there's this disconnect. Like teenagers today, I think, could relate to these characters, but they need to have the historical and cultural context to understand Romeo and Juliet's situation and how it can be seen in their own lives. It's a lot to ask a 14-year-old to understand and identify with these characters who make such extreme decisions that they couldn't see themselves making. And then on top of that, there's the language and the cultural context and all of that, when it takes so much to like be introduced to Shakespeare anyways.
And because teachers can lean on the age being as like a reason why we should care about Romeo and Juliet. I remember revisiting it at 19 and being struck by how much it felt like I felt 5 years ago.
I wonder if part of that is Shakespeare's children were around this age. His daughter was around Juliet's age when this play was written and first performed. And I wonder if the play is better suited to older audiences who have already gone through puberty, already gone through adolescence, and can look maybe more from the perspective of the adults and realize that the adults are very wrong and use that to like look at the teenagers and how the children didn't have to die in the end.
Yeah. How could we have avoided this senseless tragedy? Yeah.
Rather than asking 14-year-olds to do a lot of heavy lifting to identify with characters who experience similar feelings and thoughts, but not for the same reasons, or
who experience extremes.
And also, teenagers don't want to be told that they're being dramatic.
Yeah, no one does, really. So, yeah, all in all to say, I think that this play does a great job of showing what early modern teenagerdom was like, especially a upper class early modern English teenager in all aspects.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
And I still think we should offer a lot of grace to Romeo and Juliet and not just dismiss them as being
write them off as
dumb, stupid teenagers.
Dumb, too impulsive, too...
They're trying to self-actualize, and we take that for granted as modern readers.
And with that, thank you for listening.
I'm Kourtney Smith.
And I'm Elyse Sharp.
This is Shakespeare Anyone?
Thank you so much for listening to Shakespeare Anyone. Works referenced in this episode are available in the episode description. Our theme music is Neverending Minute by Sounds Like Sander. If you would like to support us, it would help us out if you would hit the subscribe button, like us, leave a comment, write a review, share us on social media, tell a friend about us, all the things. We'd appreciate it.
You can also support the podcast at patreon.com/Shakespeare Anyone.
Patreon patrons get access to exclusive bonus content throughout the year. The link is also in the episode description.
For more, you can visit our website, shakespeareanyone.com, follow us on Instagram at Shakespeare Anyone Pod, or Twitter at Shakespeare Anyone. For Twitter, that's Shakespeare Any and the number 1. Every other platform is spelled out like the name of the podcast.
Now, because you listened all the way to the end of the credits, here's a completely random Shakespeare quote for you. From All's Well That Ends Well, Act 4, Scene 4, said by Helen. You must know I am supposed dead.